You're a soldier defending your city. You've heard the stories, entire populations erased, rivers of blood, monuments built from human remains. Now he's at your gates. Your commander makes a choice: surrender. The conqueror promises mercy. He swears on his honor that not a single drop of your blood will be shed. You open the gates, you lay down your weapons. And that's when you realize the terrible mistake you've made. Because this man, this monster, keeps his promises, just not in the way you thought. Within hours, you and thousands of your brothers in arms are being herded into massive pits, not to be killed. No, that would be too quick. You're being buried alive. Dirt pours over your face as you scream, suffocating in darkness. And technically, the conqueror kept his word. Not a drop of blood was spilled. This actually happened. And the man who did it didn't stop there. He would go on to slaughter 17 million people, build towers from severed heads, and commit acts so disturbing that even hardened medieval chroniclers couldn't finish documenting them without becoming physically ill. Look, if you're into the darkest parts of history that no one talks about, go ahead and subscribe. We dig into this stuff all the time. And seriously, drop a like, because what's coming next is going to get so much worse. Trust me, you need to hear what happened to the fifth city. It's on a whole different level. His name was Tamerlane, and what he did to 5 cities makes every other conqueror in history look like an amateur. This is the story of calculated cruelty taken to its absolute extreme. And I need to warn you, what you're about to hear is going to stay with you. Before we dive into the nightmare, you need to understand who Tamerlane really was. Because this wasn't some mindless barbarian swinging a sword. This was a brilliant military strategist, a patron of the arts, and a man who could recite poetry in multiple languages, which somehow makes what he did even more terrifying. Born in 1336 in what's now Uzbekistan, Timur, later called Tamerlane, meaning Timur the Lame, after a battle injury left him with a limp, rose from minor nobility to become one of history's most successful conquerors. He claimed descent from Genghis Khan and made it his life's mission to rebuild the Mongol Empire. But where Genghis Khan used terror as a tool, Tamerlane elevated it to an art form. Here's what makes him different from other conquerors. Most military leaders throughout history wanted to rule the places they conquered. They needed the cities intact, the populations alive to pay taxes, the infrastructure functioning. Tamerlane, he didn't care. Submission wasn't enough. If a city resisted him or worse, rebelled after surrendering, he didn't just punish them, he made them cease to exist. And he did it with such systematic creative brutality that his reputation became his greatest weapon. Cities would hear what happened to those who defied him and surrender immediately, which was exactly his plan. Fear was his most effective soldier, and he fed it with rivers of blood. The scope of his destruction is almost incomprehensible. In just 35 years of conquest between 1370 and 1405, Tamerlane's campaigns may have killed 17 million people. To put that in perspective, the world's population at the time was only about 365 million. That means he potentially wiped out nearly 5% of everyone alive on Earth. Think about that. 1 in every 20 humans who existed during his lifetime may have died because of him. Now, historians debate the exact numbers. They always do with medieval body counts. But even if we cut that figure in half, we're still talking about mass death on a scale that staggers the imagination. And unlike natural disasters or plagues, this was deliberate, methodical, personal. So, how did he do it? What specific acts of horror made entire civilizations tremble at the mention of his name? Let's find out. And I'm warning you now. These 5 acts are going to get progressively more disturbing. Our journey into Tamerlane's methods begins in the year 1400 in the city of Sivas, located in what's now central Turkey. At this time, Casus was under the control of the Ottoman Empire and defended by a garrison of soldiers, mostly Armenian Christians, who had every reason to fear what was coming. By 1400, Tamerlane's reputation had spread across the known world, Every soldier defending Kaz knew the stories. They'd heard about the cities that had been erased, the populations massacred, the unthinkable cruelties inflicted on those who resisted. So when Tamerlane's massive army appeared on the horizon, the defenders of seas faced an impossible choice: fight and die, or surrender and maybe die. The siege began and the garrison held out as long as they could, but they were outnumbered, outmatched, and running out of hope. That's when Tamerlane, ever the psychological master, made them an offer that seemed too good to be true. He sent word to the defenders: "Surrender now, and I give you my solemn promise, not a single drop of your blood will be shed." It was a binding oath sworn before witnesses, the kind of promise that meant something in medieval warfare. Commanders were often known to honor such oaths. It was practically a code. The garrison debated. Some argued it was a trap. Others pointed out that they had no chance of victory anyway. At least this way there was a possibility of survival. Eventually, desperation won. The gates of seas opened and somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 Armenian soldiers laid down their weapons and walked out to surrender. And this where Tamerlane revealed his genius for technicality and terror, his soldiers immediately rounded up the surrendered garrison. The Armenians were probably confused at first. Weren't they supposed to be spared? Then they were marched outside the city walls where Tamerlane's men had been busy digging. Not graves exactly, something much larger. Massive trenches deep and wide. And then it became clear Tamerlane had kept his promise. Not a single drop of blood would be shed because he wasn't going to use swords or spears or arrows. He was going to bury them alive. Try to imagine the horror of that moment. You've surrendered. You've given up your only means of defense, trusting in an oath. And now you're staring into a pit. Realizing what's about to happen, some of the soldiers probably tried to run, others begged, some fought with their bare hands. It didn't matter. The contemporary sources describe what happened next in brutal detail. Groups of prisoners were forced to the edges of the trenches. Then they were pushed in. Not killed first, pushed in alive. And then the dirt came. Shovels at first, then cartloads. Then torrents of earth pouring down on screaming men. The ones at the bottom were crushed by the weight of bodies falling on top of them. The ones higher up had to watch the dirt rise, covering their legs, their chests, their faces. Some died from suffocation within minutes. Others, trapped in air pockets, might have lasted hours in the darkness, feeling the weight of earth and corpses pressing down on them, slowly running out of oxygen. All 3,000 to 4,000 soldiers died this way, and Tamerlane could stand before anyone and say truthfully that he had kept his word. Not one drop of blood had been shed. But the real brilliance, if we can call something so monstrous brilliant, wasn't just in the act itself. It was in what it communicated. This wasn't about killing the soldiers of Zeus. It was about sending a message that would spread like wildfire across every kingdom, every city, every fortress in his path. The message was this: surrender means nothing, mercy is an illusion, promises are word games, and Tamerlane is always thinking 3 moves ahead. News of Sphere spread fast. Suddenly every city had to recalculate. Maybe fighting to the death was actually the better option because at least you'd die with a sword in your hand rather than dirt in your lungs. Or maybe immediate surrender was the only hope, because who knew what Tamerlane would do if you made him work for it? This is what made Tamerlane so terrifying. He wasn't just a conqueror. He was a psychological architect building structures of fear inside people's minds. And Casus was just his opening act. Because if you thought burying 4,000 men alive was bad, wait until you hear what he did to cities that actually defied him. If Cass was a lesson in twisted promises, then what Tamerlane did to the city of Urgench was something else entirely. This was about making a place and everyone in it vanished from the earth, as if they had never existed. Urgench was one of the jewels of Central Asia. Located in what's now Turkmenistan, it sat along the Silk Road trade routes and was the capital of the Khwarezmian region. The city was wealthy, cultured, filled with libraries, mosques, bustling markets, and beautiful homes. It was, by all accounts, a place worth ruling. But Urgench made a catastrophic mistake. It rebelled. Now, rebellions happened all the time in medieval empires. Usually a conqueror would show up, put down the rebellion, execute the leaders, maybe do some strategic terror to make a point and then get back to collecting taxes, because you need those cities functioning to fund your empire, right? Not Tamerlane. For him, rebellion wasn't a political problem to solve. It was a personal insult that required total retribution. In 1388, after Urgench dared to resist his rule, Tamerlane returned with his army. This wasn't going to be a siege in the traditional sense. This was going to be an execution, not of people, of the city itself. His forces surrounded Urgench and began the attack. The defenders fought desperately, but they were facing one of the most effective military machines the world had ever seen. City walls that had stood for centuries were breached. And then the real horror began. Tamerlane's orders were clear and methodical. First, kill everyone. And I mean everyone. Men, women, children, elderly, rich, poor. It didn't matter. This wasn't about eliminating soldiers or punishing leaders. This was total population elimination. Contemporary chroniclers describe the streets running with so much blood that it formed streams. But Timur wasn't finished, because you can rebuild a city if the structures remain. You can repopulate it. In a generation or two it might return. Tamerlane couldn't allow that, so he gave his next order. Level everything, destroy every building, every mosque. And remember, these were Muslim mosques. And Tamerlane himself was Muslim. So this wasn't even religious destruction. This was pure obliteration. Every library with its precious manuscripts, every home, every shop, every well, every wall. His soldiers spent weeks tearing down Urgench stone by stone. Buildings that had taken years to construct were reduced to rubble. The systematic destruction was so thorough that archaeologists today have trouble even figuring out where parts of the city used to be. But here's where it gets even more disturbing. Where Tamerlane's actions crossed from military brutality into something almost ritualistic. According to multiple historical sources, after the city was reduced to ruins, Tamerlane ordered his men to do something bizarre. Plow the rubble and plant barley over it. Think about what that means symbolically. Barley is what you plant in fields, farmland, empty land. By ordering barley to be sown over Urgench, Tamerlane was making a statement. This is no longer a city. This is not even worthy of being called ruins. This is farmland now. This place has been uncreated. Some historians debate whether the barley planting actually happened, or if it's an embellishment added by chroniclers to emphasize the totality of the destruction. But honestly, it doesn't matter, because whether it's literally true or metaphorically true, everyone understood the message. Urgench was gone. Not conquered, not occupied. Gone. And here's the really chilling part. It worked. Urgench never recovered. The site was eventually abandoned. A new city with the same name was built miles away, but it wasn't the same place. The original Urgench, with its centuries of history, its culture, its people, ceased to exist. Tamerlane had done something that most conquerors only talk about. He had actually erased a city. But that raises a question. What happened when a city was smart enough to surrender immediately? What if they didn't resist at all? Would Tamerlane show mercy? Then the Persian city of Isfahan was about to find out. And the answer they got was one of the most horrifying episodes in all of medieval history. Isfahan was one of the great cities of medieval Persia, a center of art, science, and Islamic scholarship. When Tamerlane's army approached in 1387, the city's leaders made what seemed like the smart choice. They surrendered immediately. No resistance, no siege. They opened the gates, laid down their weapons, and submitted. And amazingly, Tamerlane showed mercy. He didn't massacre the population. He stationed a garrison in the city, installed his own administrators, and imposed a tax on the citizens to pay or his military campaigns. It was standard occupation procedure. Isfahan had made the right choice. They were going to survive. For a few weeks, life under Tamerlane's rule was bearable. Sure, there were foreign soldiers in the streets and new taxes to pay, but at least everyone was alive. The buildings still stood, children still played, markets still opened. But then the people of Isfahan made a catastrophic miscalculation. They got angry about the taxes, and that anger turned into rebellion. It probably started small, grumbling in the markets, complaints about the occupiers, but it escalated. Citizens began attacking Tamerlane's tax collectors. Then they went after his soldiers. In a coordinated uprising, the people of Isfahan killed the garrison Tamerlane had left behind. Word reached Tamerlane, and those who knew him understood immediately. Isfahan had just signed its death warrant. Because here's the thing about Tamerlane's psychology. You could fight him from the start and he'd respect it in a twisted way. He'd destroy you, but that was expected. What he absolutely could not tolerate was being shown mercy, and then having that mercy thrown back in his face. That was personal. When Tamerlane returned to Isfahan, he didn't come to reoccupy the city. He came to make an example that would echo through history. His orders to his army were specific and absolutely bone-chilling. He commanded a general massacre, which was horrible enough, but he added a quota system that turned his soldiers into hunting parties. Each military unit had to return with a specific number of severed heads. Not prisoners, not bodies. Heads. The army swept through Isfahan like a wave of death. Soldiers went door to door, dragging people into the streets, men, women, children. The quota didn't discriminate. The killing went on for days. The streets became rivers of blood. The screaming must have been deafening. Contemporary sources claim the death toll reached 200,000. Modern historians think that number is inflated and suggest around 70,000 is more accurate. But here's the thing. Does it really matter if it was 70,000 or 200,000? Both numbers are incomprehensible acts of mass murder. The human brain can't even properly process death on that scale. But the killing was just the beginning of Isfahan's nightmare, because Tamerlane had plans for all those severed heads. He ordered his men to collect them, all of them. Tens of thousands of human heads piled up in the streets, flies swarming, the stench unbearable. And then he gave an order that still seems impossible. Build towers with them. His soldiers constructed pyramids of human skulls. Think about that for a moment. Not monuments to the dead, monuments from the dead. Human beings reduced to building materials. One eyewitness chronicler, a man who had seen plenty of medieval warfare, tried to count them. He documented 28 of these towers before he literally couldn't continue. The chronicler wrote that each tower contained approximately 1,500 heads, and that he became too physically ill to finish counting. The smell, the sight, the sheer horror of it overwhelmed him. Even if we assume some exaggeration in the sources, and medieval chroniclers did love to inflate numbers for dramatic effect, we're still talking about towers of human skulls standing throughout a major city. Multiple towers, each one representing thousands of people who had been alive just days before. These weren't hidden away. They were deliberately placed in public spaces at city gates and main squares. They were meant to be seen. Tamerlane wanted every person who entered Isfahan, every traveler passing through, every merchant on the Silk Road to see what happened when you defied him. And it worked. The skull towers of Isfahan became legendary. They stood for years, some sources say decades, slowly deteriorating, a constant reminder of Tamerlane's vengeance. Stories about them spread across the known world. Parents would tell their children about the towers, merchants would describe them in horror. Military commanders would reference them when debating whether to resist or surrender. Isfahan had gambled that they could rebel after surrendering, that Tamerlane was too far away or too busy to respond. They were wrong. And the price wasn't just paid by those who participated in the rebellion, it was paid by the entire population, transformed into architectural warnings to never ever cross Tamerlane again. But if you think towers of skulls represent the peak of Tamerlane's brutality, we're not even close to finished. Because what he did to Delhi makes Isfahan look almost restrained by comparison. By 1398, Tamerlane had conquered most of Central Asia and Persia. He was in his 60 seconds, ancient by medieval standards, but his appetite for conquest hadn't diminished at all. His gaze now turned south toward the legendary wealth of India. The Delhi Sultanate ruled northern India at the time. It was rich, powerful, and according to Tamerlane, way too soft. His official justification for invasion: the Muslim Sultan of Delhi weren't being harsh enough toward their Hindu subjects. Never mind that Tamerlane's own empire included plenty of non-Muslims who he taxed but didn't systematically persecute. This was about wealth and conquest, dressed up in religious rhetoric. Tamerlane assembled a massive army, over 90,000 soldiers, and began his march through northern India. And I need you to understand something. This wasn't a clean military campaign with armies meeting on battlefields. This was a rolling apocalypse. As Tamerlane's forces moved through the Indian countryside, they plundered everything. Villages were razed, crops were burned, anyone who resisted was killed, and anyone who didn't resist was taken captive to be sold as slaves. The army was so effective at this systematic looting that they soon had a massive problem: too many prisoners. Historical accounts claim Tamerlane's forces had captured around 100,000 Hindu prisoners by the time they approached Delhi. Think about the logistics of that for a second. That's 100,000 people who need to be guarded, fed, and kept from escaping. An entire city's worth of captives, all traveling with the army. Tamerlane looked at this situation and saw a tactical liability. He was about to face the Sultan's army in what would be the decisive battle of the campaign. The last thing he needed was 100,000 prisoners potentially rebelling behind his lines in the middle of the fight. So he made a decision that exemplifies his absolutely cold, calculating brutality. Kill them all. In a single day, Tamerlane ordered the execution of an estimated 100,000 prisoners. Not in battle, not while they were resisting. Just systematic mass execution. The chroniclers describe his camp becoming a slaughterhouse with soldiers spending hours just killing unarmed people. The ground became so soaked with blood it turned into mud. Try to wrap your mind around that. 100,000 people, that's more than die in most wars. And this happened in one day before the actual battle had even started. Then on December 17, 1398, Tamerlane faced the Sultan's army outside Delhi. And this is where we see not just his brutality but his tactical genius. Because the Sultan had a secret weapon: 120 war elephants. These weren't just elephants, they were covered in chain mail armor and had poisoned blades attached to their tusks. They were the medieval equivalent of tanks, designed to break enemy formations and cause absolute chaos. The Sultan was confident these elephants would win the day. But Tamerlane had done his intelligence work. He knew about the elephants and he had a plan that sounds absolutely insane but apparently worked. According to multiple historical sources, Tamerlane loaded his baggage camels with hay and dried grass. Then, as the Sultan's elephant corps charged, he had his men set the camels on fire and drive them straight at the elephants. Imagine being a war elephant trained for battle. And suddenly you're facing dozens of screaming, flaming camels running right at you. The elephants panicked. They turned and stampeded back through their own army, trampling hundreds of the Sultan's soldiers. The battle turned into a chaotic rout, and Delhi's defenders collapsed. The city was defenseless. What followed was 5 days of organized devastation that makes everything we've discussed so far seem almost tame by comparison. This wasn't rage. This wasn't revenge. This was methodical, systematic destruction. Tamerlane's soldiers swept through Delhi in organized units. Every neighborhood was targeted. Citizens were massacred in the streets, in their homes, in mosques where they'd sought sanctuary. The chroniclers described blood flowing through the streets like rivers. The smoke from burning buildings was so thick it blocked out the sun. The plundering was just as systematic. Every valuable was stripped. Gold, jewels, silk, spices. Artisans were taken as slaves to work in Tamerlane's capital. Beautiful young women and men were taken for the slave markets. The libraries were burned. The monuments were vandalized. The contemporary accounts describe something that sounds almost apocalyptic. One chronicler wrote that the stench of rotting corpses became so overwhelming that Delhi had to be completely abandoned. Survivors fled into the countryside. The city, one of the great capitals of the medieval world, became a ghost town of corpses and ruins. But Tamerlane hasn't done making his point. Remember those 120 war elephants that had panicked, the ones that were supposed to be the Sultan's ultimate weapon? Tamerlane captured 90 of them, and in a final act of dominance that perfectly captures his psychology, he didn't kill them, he put them to work. He forced the elephants, symbols of Indian power and majesty, to haul stones all the way back to his capital city of Samarkand. There they would be used to build a mosque. The mighty war elephants of Delhi reduced to beast of burden, building monuments to Tamerlane's glory. It was humiliation and pragmatism combined. The perfect Tamerlane move. The destruction of Delhi was so total that it took the city over a century to recover. A century. Think about that. Children born the day Tamerlane left Delhi would die of old age before the city fully rebuilt. But we're not done yet, because Tamerlane had one more city to destroy, one more act of horror that would cement his legacy as perhaps the most brutally creative conqueror in human history. And this time he was going to combine all his previous methods into one final masterpiece of terror. Baghdad, the legendary city. For 5 centuries it had been the heart of Islamic civilization, a center of learning, science, art, and culture. By 1401 it had declined from its golden age, but it was still a city of immense historical significance and wealth. Tamerlane had actually already conquered Baghdad once, and the city had submitted. But while he was off campaigning elsewhere, Baghdad's former ruler managed to retake it. When Tamerlane heard the news, you can imagine his reaction. This wasn't just rebellion. This was a city that had surrendered, accepted his rule, and then switched sides the moment his back was turned. He returned to Baghdad with vengeance on his mind, and by now he had perfected his methods of terror. After a 40-day siege, his forces breached the walls, and then Tamerlane gave an order that would result in one of history's most horrifying massacres. He implemented what we saw in Isfahan, but on an even larger, more systematic scale. Every soldier in his army, and we're talking about tens of thousands of soldiers, was given a quota return with at least 2 severed heads. Not 1, 2, minimum. Think about what that order does psychologically. It turns massacre into a competition. It creates pressure on every single soldier to not just kill, but to kill multiple people and prove it. Because if you don't meet your quota, you face your commander's punishment. And given what Tamerlane did to his enemies, imagine what he did to his own men who failed him. The soldiers of Tamerlane's army spread through Baghdad like locusts. They went street by street, house by house, hunting people. And because of the quota system, they couldn't be selective. They couldn't just kill combatants or rebels. They needed heads, plural, and they needed them fast. The death toll estimates vary wildly, anywhere from 20,000 to 90,000 people. The truth is probably somewhere in that range, but the exact number almost doesn't matter at this point. What matters is understanding the sheer frenzy of violence that the quota system created. Contemporary chroniclers describe scenes of absolute horror. Soldiers breaking into homes and dragging out entire families. Citizens trying to hide in wells and attics and crypts, anywhere they might escape. The streets becoming impossible because of the piles of corpses. But here's where it gets even more disturbing, if that's even possible. At this point, the quota was so strict and the fear of failing to meet it was so intense that soldiers started killing their own captives. Valuable slaves they could have sold just to make the count. Some sources even claim that soldiers who couldn't find enough victims in the city killed their own wives to meet the requirement. Now that last detail might be exaggeration or propaganda, but the fact that chroniclers found it believable tells you everything about the atmosphere Timur created. The killing had become so systematic, so mandatory that nothing was off limits. But of course, the heads weren't just discarded. This is Tamerlane we're talking about. He had plans just like in Isfahan. The severed heads were collected and used to build towers, but this time on a scale that dwarfed even that earlier horror. Some sources claim there were 120 of these skull towers built throughout Baghdad. 120. Even if that number is inflated, and again medieval chroniclers did exaggerate, we're still talking about dozens of these monuments to mass death. The towers stood at major intersections at city gates and public squares. Each one represented hundreds or thousands of people who had been alive just days earlier. The smell must have been unbearable, the sight permanently scarring to anyone who witnessed it. Tamerlane also ordered the destruction of Baghdad's great public buildings. Libraries full of precious manuscripts were burned. Palaces were torn down. The physical infrastructure of one of history's greatest cities was systematically dismantled. Interestingly, he spared the religious sites, mosques, and shrines. This wasn't out of respect. It was strategy. He wanted people to see that he wasn't waging war against Islam. He was waging war against disobedience. The religious buildings stood as lonely monuments in a sea of ruins, emphasizing the message, God's houses remain. Everything else is forfeit. Baghdad, like Delhi before it, was left a hollow shell of its former self. The survivors fled, the economy collapsed, the cultural legacy was shattered, and the towers of skulls stood for years as a warning to anyone else who might consider defying Tamerlane. So there you have it. 5 acts of calculated terror that made Tamerlane's name a synonym for brutality. From the buried soldiers of Sivas to the skull towers of Baghdad, he didn't just conquer, he performed. Every massacre was a message, every atrocity was a strategy. He understood something that most conquerors didn't. Your reputation can fight battles for you. Make people terrified enough and they'll surrender before you even arrive. He turned horror into a military asset. And it worked. He built an empire stretching from Turkey to India, from Russia to the Persian Gulf. But here's the thing about empires built on fear. They don't last. Tamerlane died in 1405, just 7 years after sacking Delhi while planning an invasion of China. Within decades his empire had fragmented. His descendants fought each other. The territories split apart, but the memory that lasted centuries later, people still invoke his name. The skull towers may have crumbled, but the stories didn't. And that's perhaps the most chilling part of all. Tamerlane got exactly what he wanted, immortality. We're talking about him right now, 620 years after his death. He's still winning. So, which act do you think was the most horrifying? The calculated cruelty of burying men alive at Sivas, the complete erasure of Urgench, the skull towers of Isfahan, the apocalyptic sack of Delhi, or the Quota system of Baghdad? Let me know in the comments which one disturbed you the most. And if you made it this far, you're clearly into the darkest corners of history. We cover this kind of content every week, the stories they don't teach you in school, the brutal truths about human nature, the monsters who actually existed. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one. Thanks for watching, and remember, the scariest monsters are the ones who actually live. Ed.